Hello, this is Todd Luck, and recently I did a review of John Carter, Gods Have Forgotten. This is one of the new novels in the Edgar Rice Burroughs universe, and in my review I said I really liked it. It definitely sated my Warriors palette. And in the comments I actually got a question on if I plan to do an Easter egg guide for the novel, similar to what I did with Tarzan Battle for Pellucidar. Kind of the difference here is Tarzan was just filled with all these different Easter eggs that weren't explained to the new reader. And John Carter has crystal clear storytelling. References are explained and sometimes annotated. And the references are almost entirely to Mars novels. So I didn't really feel an urge to do a Easter egg guide. But I got to thinking about it, and there were just a lot of things I couldn't say about this novel because my review was non-spoiler and I didn't want to spoil the novel for anyone. However, I thought, well, why don't I just do a video where I give my spoiler thoughts on it and talk about things that stood out to me in the novel. So there will be no worm hopping in this video. So if you don't want this novel spoiled, then I suggest you pause it. You can check out my non-spoiler review. But otherwise, let's get into some spoilers. And I'm going to try not to be too redundant with my review, but I just wanted to point something out that I kind of forgot to say. I alluded to this, but I was really jazzed to see a novel-accurate depiction, or at least an interpretation of the description in the novel, of a Martian woman, because normally this never happens on covers, right? Usually it's a pasty and thong or a bikini or something. Nothing related to what's actually described in the novel. And this gets me really excited because I'm really looking forward to those Burroughs authorized editions with the Joe Jusko covers, because Joe Jusko is now a more mature artist. As amazing as his original works were, he has gotten even better as an artist. He has more time. He's more familiar with the subject matter, you know, and he's working with a different Burroughs ink. And I think we're going to get some really amazing covers showing the worlds of Edgar Rice Burroughs in a more accurate way than we've ever seen before with Joe Jusko painting, right? And so I'm super jazzed at that. I just wanted to point that out before we get started. All right, so the novel begins with John Carter, who is essentially the king of Mars. That's what Warlord of Mars is. He's Jeddak, king of kings, right? And he's in this bureaucratic meeting. He's bored out of his mind, and his brain is just going back to when he was a warrior, before he became king, and he just wishes he could just go out on a speeder and just fly out in the Barsoom and have adventures. And this had me grinning from ear to ear, because every Robert E. Howard fan will recognize this as the beginning of so many King Conan and Cole stories. And I don't know if that was a coincidence or not, but I just love that to death. Now, the big difference between John Carter and those characters, though, is that John Carter loves just about every other aspect of his life. And we see that portrayed so well at the beginning here. He loves Deja Torres. He's just spending time with her. And it's really beautiful. It has a very chill kind of atmosphere in that first chapter. And Edgar Rice Burroughs' novels tend to have the guy get the girl, and then the hero is, like, you know, made king or ruler of something. And it's just one of those scenes where you actually get to see that character enjoy all of that. I just kept thinking to myself, this is what happily ever after looks like. But of course, that first chapter ends on that sad, poignant note with the death of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I'm just going to talk about all the Burroughs tributes here. The one at the start was very well done, very poignant, and it really kind of made that bittersweetness of immortality for John Carter very obvious, right? He's alive and he's able to enjoy his life, but he's going to watch all these people he knew on Earth just wither and die. And, you know, that's sad for him, right? But what I really didn't expect was to see it keep coming up. You know, they kept consoling him for the loss of his relative Edgar Rice Burroughs. And so at the end is probably the most unexpected one, where there's a Burroughs doodad that helps guide an airship. And we don't know exactly how that got there, but we do know that that is a symbol that Edgar Rice Burroughs used. And so the implication there is that, like his characters, after his death, he has gotten to roam around on different planets, which is kind of cool. It's kind of this mysterious hint at an afterlife for the character in his own works. And at the end, I think, was the one that took me off guard the most, because it was this scene where, we tell our children stories of, Martian heroes, right? But what do you tell a child on Mars? What stories do you tell him of Earth? And of course, you tell him stories of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I just thought that was very clever. And the final line where, what did you tell him when he asked him about if he was still alive? And, John Carter says, he still lives. And I choked up. I mean, that was really, really powerful stuff. And I think this novel really does illustrate that the spirit of Edgar Rice Burroughs does absolutely live on. And then, of course, he does get to go out on a flyer and go see the Northern Lights, just a joyride, right? And I thought this was so perfect, right? There's so many moments that humanize John Carter in this one, and this was such a dad thing for him to do. It so reminds me of my own father, right? My dad loves to get in the car and just drive someplace just to see something, right? He could drive for hours just to go see a site, right? During the COVID lockdown, when everything was shut down, right? All your entertainment venues and all that stuff in the state were shut down. You couldn't eat inside of a restaurant. He drove to the other side of the state just to pick up lunch at a Chick-fil-A drive-thru and eat it in the parking lot just so he could get out of the house and see stuff, right? So, John Carter getting in a flyer to go see the Northern Lights just felt like such a dad thing to do, and was so perfect, since him being a father was such a big part of this novel. And of course, he brings Woola along, which was very cool. Woola doesn't appear a whole lot in this novel, but that makes sense, right? John Carter's not going to bring his dog everywhere. But I did love his portrayal, and it sort of made me realize John Carter is Fred Flintstone, right? He's got a dog and 2 kids, right? And the dog even knocks him over, with excitement every time he sees him. But I thought that was quite well done. And while he's out there, he encounters science mysteries. And we're not talking like, the Tesseract or some kind of glowing thing that can do anything the writer wants it to do. Actual real science mysteries, or at least theoretical science, right? He encounters this thing with gravity that actually killed people, right? And it's kind of this mystery of like, why did this gravitational field exist? Why was this force that crushing these people, right? Gravity doesn't really work like that. And then, of course, he encounters the mysterious city, which seems to be like kind of out of sync with his reality, like it's in another dimension, right? And those really felt like something else, right, other than Burroughs, right? To me, it really felt like something I would expect to see in like Ray Bradbury or Harlan Ellison. And I love that. I it just made me kind of wonder what would happen if those guys had gotten a hold of Mars, because Mars is such a big, diverse planet, and you could tell so many different types of stories on there, and it just kind of got my brain going about, the different kinds of tales you could have on Barsoom. But of course, science mystery is just one of many different types of storytelling used in here. There are moments when it feels like a horror novel, or something that feels like espionage, there are epic sword fights, just so many different types of storytelling in this novel, and all of it is kind of brought together by this feeling of isolation and unpredictability you get. He's out there cut off from everything he knows, and you're never quite sure how he's going to get out of the situation. And of course, he does get out of that situation up north and returns to Helium, which is kind of nice, because a lot of novels, you never come back to Helium. You start there and then you're just out there in Barsoom for the rest of the novel, right? So it was just nice to see him come back to his family. And some of the family I don't think we've seen before. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe his mother-in-law and I guess grandmother-in-law were new, and I thought that was really cool. I love that relationship. You know, John Carter can take down an army, but his mother-in-law, you know, I think we've all been there. You know, if you're married, you've been in that situation. And there is a mention of DJ Thoris's brother, who, of course, we meet later on, and you know, it was a great plot twist to find out that character was her brother. I believe this is new as well. I couldn't find any reference to a long lost brother when I did a word search on the novels. And there was a long lost brother that was introduced in the comics, but this is a completely different character with a different name. The brother introduced in the comics was just made up for the comics. He was like a long lost crazy brother who became a supervillain. This is a very different character. And then he checks in on a public works project that he started where he had his men go around and clean out the dungeons underneath the city. And so the dungeons underneath like cities in Mars are old and people don't go down there. And so anything could be down there, right? People can go down there and do some really bad stuff. You know, you got prisoners who kind of disappear and all this stuff. And so that was a setup for later with the All-Scar, right? And so that set up the disappearing prisoners, that set up the long arms, which would be the final reveal of what those mysterious creatures that John Carter would encounter in dungeons in the Burroughs novels, like he'd only see their eyes or something, never quite know what those creatures were, and those were the long arms, these creatures that were created by the slaves of the All-Scar. But it just got my imagination going, the idea of this public works project, cleaning up these dungeons where, you know, you have all these, you know, things down there, all these creatures or these bad people who are down there doing unspeakable things. And it just got me thinking like, oh my gosh, you could do entire novelettes or novels based on that. You know, it could be Catacombs of Mars, or I don't know, Janitor of Mars. You could have a cover with the guy with a sword in one hand and a mop in the other. I don't know, it teases the imagination. So in my review, I praised the portrayal of Tara, but I forgot to mention how much I love the portrayal of everyone's favorite disembodied head, Ghek. I love the idea of giving him an artificial body, which we get to see here on the map page at the beginning. I loved what was done with him and the rest of the Caldane. And this is really hats off to the author, because there's a lot of novels that are very easy to follow up on. Burroughs would oftentimes leave his novels very open-ended and establish things he never did. So there's a lot of novels that would be very easy to do a follow-up on. Chessmen of Mars, which introduces the Caldane, is not one of them. This has everything very tightly wrapped up by the end. The Caldane, yes, are still there, but Burroughs very thoroughly establishes that they are creatures of pure intellect and they don't have any desire to mess with anyone on Mars. The only reason you would have to have a conflict with the Caldane is if you went to the Valley of Bantoon where they live. And so it was just absolute brilliance to have them go to the Valley of Bantoon to try to steal a body for Ghek. I thought that was great. Body heists are the best. It was probably inspired by Mastermind of Mars, which basically has a body heist. That's what the entire novel is about, but I thought it was really well done here. And I love the idea of the Caldane being attacked and that being their motivation to actually respond to something outside of their own valley. I think that made a lot of sense. And I love the ending where Ghek becomes the warlord of Bantoon. Just perfect. And of course, things go awry when they try to steal the body. And just when you think you've got everything figured out, here comes Betty freaking Callwell. And as the annotation in the novel said, she is a character from Escape on Venus. And in the story in there, it introduces her as this character who was inexplicably transported to Amtor, or Venus. And it's very similar to what happened with John Carter, how he got to Mars. And this is never explained. It's just kind of this open-ended mystery. And so there is actually a little bit more done with Betty Callwell after that. There was a comic by American Mythology. This is a 3-issue miniseries called Carson of Venus, The Flames Beyond. And it features what happened to Betty Callwell after Escape on Venus. Now, it's not listed as canon, but I will point out that at the end, Betty ends up on Barsoom. And it's also written by Christopher Paul Carey, who is in charge of all of these novels. So I'm not sure if it's canon, but at least it's canon adjacent at the very least. And then, of course, John Carter eventually ends up in the underground world, what is called the Perfect World, and gets to meet the villains of the piece, the Ulskar. And I gotta say, this is exquisitely established throughout the novel, right? We hint at these worms that they considered sacred, and there's the term of worm hopping because people go through all these different convolutions to try to not step on these worms that they considered sacred. And it so fits in with Burroughs's parodies of religion that you get throughout his novels, and it's so great. And then he walks through those rooms filled with all those different bugs, and you see those giant worms, and the reader can kind of figure out that the villains are the worms before John Carter does, and you're just screaming at the page. It's like, it's the worms, John Carter, it's the worms. And then, at the end, he is told, it's like, haven't you guessed, it's the worms. And the worms work so well. I mean, they are inhuman, they're creepy, and symbolically, they dwell in darkness and in the earth, and they're associated with death, and all of that comes into play. And their motivations make sense, right? They don't want to be on the surface while it has oxygen, so they're just kind of sitting there in their perfect world underground waiting for the planet to die. Except those darn Barsunians come up with air factories to prolong the life of the planet, and so they got to do something about that. And yes, there is a grand conspiracy where they're trying to do this, but it's not something that changes what was in the previous novel. It just fills in these very natural gaps that were left in those novels. Who sabotaged the air factory in those early novels? Where did that inexplicable storm come from? This, giant storm that nobody had ever seen anything like that in Chessmen of Mars. Little things like that, questions that you'd either forgotten or didn't even know to ask. And of course, their underground world was extraordinarily creepy, and just the idea of being taken into this underground world that's very much like hell, right? I mean, it's divided into circles, just like Dante's hell, right? To be trapped there for eternity, no one even knowing you're missing, no one even knowing you're still alive, is just extremely frightening. And it was just well played how all these forgotten characters ended up down there. And so that makes the Ulskar one of the possible interpretations of the title of this novel. They are the gods of the forgotten, the gods of all of these forgotten Barsunians that they've kidnapped and enslaved. And then, of course, that brings us to the golden skin race, the Calivars, that we get to meet in this novel. And, of course, this is the second interpretation of what the title could mean, gods of the forgotten. In this interpretation, the worms are the forgotten, and the Calivar, their creators, are their gods. And there were some major revelations with the gold-skinned Martians. So they are a race that predates all the current races on Mars. They are ancient, millions of years old species, and so they genetically engineered some of the species that we currently have in novels to help them survive the harsh environmental apocalypse that was happening, right? The loss of the air, the loss of the seas. And so one of the things that specifically said is that they engineered the Tharks. And I think that's fine because this is millions of years removed. This would be like the equivalent of revealing something happened on Earth during the Jurassic period. It just doesn't really relate to our current history, and it doesn't change anything, right? The Tharks are still the Tharks. This isn't some stupid thing where they're villains who were like, we genetically engineered the Tharks to have 4 arms so we could conquer the universe, or something like that, you know. And it's amusing that, you know, in some ancient time, there was some gold-skinned scientist who was just looking around at all the animals on Mars and was like, you know what, I think they need more limbs. And then there's a scene where John Carter meets a Vagos from Vana, which is the world inside the moon. And, you know, you're sitting there thinking like, well, obviously this is to tie into the novelette at the end. And of course it does. But then at the end of that chapter, after the Vagos has disappeared, John Carter says that he would see their kind again many years later, and it would not be on Barsoom. And I don't know for certain, but there is a novel where that actually does happen. At least that's my understanding. I haven't read the novel, but I've read, you know, like the summary of it and stuff. And it is Swords Against the Moon Men. And I don't have the novel, so I'll just hold up this really gorgeous artwork by Mark Wheatley that's from the novel. And Swords Against the Moon Men is not supposed to be canon, is my understanding. It's part of the Wild Adventures of Edgar Rice Burroughs, but it is written by Christopher Paul Carey. And so perhaps that was referring to something else they just haven't revealed, you know, maybe another type of canon story, or maybe they are planning to canonize Swords Against the Moon Men. But again, like that miniseries I was talking about with Betty Callwell, if it's not canon, at least it's canon adjacent. And of course, after plotting and conflicts and revolution, there are happy endings for everyone, even the worms. And that brings us to the Quantum Interlude, which is the post-credit scene that is teasing the Victory Harbin novel. And so we get kind of further confirmation about how the fantastic places that Burroughs wrote about are in other dimensions. And we also get a reference to a cluster of stars that is from the Beyond the Furthest Star novel. And so that's not too surprising considering Victory Harbin has been the star of the Beyond the Furthest Star comic, and so that comic will be followed up on in the novel and also in a graphic novel that's coming up, so I definitely look forward to that. And so that is my spoiler thoughts on this wonderful novel, but that is not the end for Gary Gravel's work on Mars. There is a novelette in the upcoming Red Axe of Pellucidar, which Gary Gravel will be writing, and it's called Across the Moons of Mars, and it'll be starring Jason Gridley and Betty Callwell. So I definitely look forward to that. You can pre-order that right now. It's up on edgarriceburroughs.com for pre-order. All right, that's it. Like and subscribe for more videos, and until next time, see ya.